Good evening, Karina Carvalho with ABC News. Queensland Nickel's administrators have recommended the company be wound up. FTI Consulting has delivered a scathing report saying Clive Palmer acted recklessly. It also found the troubled Townsville refinery could have continued operating if money wasn't moved to Mr Palmer's other business interests.
3 months after Queensland Nickel went into administration, FTI Consulting has handed down its report into what went wrong. Clive Palmer was out ahead of the release.
Look, I'm a member of Parliament. I retired from business 3 years ago.
But that's not the administrator's view. Its report says he was signing off on company expenditure. Our observations indicate Mr Palmer appears to have acted as a shadow director of Queensland Nickel from February 2012 up to the date of our appointment. And the administrator is highly critical of Mr Palmer and his nephew, Clive Menzick, when they were directors, saying they appear to have been reckless in exercising their duties and powers, and that ultimately the determination of whether the directors have breached their duties will be made by a court.
This is the biggest beat-up.
The administrators have recommended Queensland Nickel be liquidated and may have been trading insolvent. The company's collapse has left 800 workers unemployed. They're owed almost $74 million in entitlements. The administrators have determined they could get as little as nothing, but no more than 52% of what's liquidated.
What I'd like to see now is the federal government take that on board and get the processes in place to pay out the entitlements guarantee to all those employees.
The Employment Minister says if the federal government ends up paying worker entitlements, it'll be the biggest in the government's history under the current scheme.
I came in, put billions of dollars in, $4,000 million has gone into North Queensland out of our money to save jobs for 9 years.
He needs to explain what he's done. The administrator has expressed most serious concerns.
FTI Consulting also found the company forgave almost $190 million in loans for the benefit of director-related parties. The report says Qd Resources bought and sold 60 vintage cars for Palmer's Coolum Resort, but never saw the money. Queensland Nickel also made a payment to Clive Palmer's Titanic 2 project. The administrators say if the money hadn't been moved between Queensland Nickel and Clive Palmer's other business interests, the refinery could have survived for several more years, riding out the low nickel price.
I would say, assuming he renominates, I think the electors of Fairfax will cast a very stern judgment on him.
Queensland Nickel's creditors will meet next week to decide the company's fate. Jessie Dorset, ABC News, Townsville.
Legal experts say appointing shadow directors to Queensland Nickel won't absolve Clive Palmer of his responsibility or protect his assets. Here's finance correspondent Philip Lasker.
Make no mistake, Queensland Nickel's administrator has found serious problems, potentially breaching Section 184 of the Corporations Act.
To be found guilty under that, that's a criminal offence. You have to be found to have acted recklessly.
The company in trouble, Queensland Nickel, employs the workers, pays suppliers and has been loaded up with $100 million in debt. Queensland Nickel's owners are Qd Resources and Qd Metals. They hold all the assets worth more than $1 billion. Queensland Nickel pays its owners for the right to refine nickel. Mr Palmer's not a director of any of these companies. He's a director and shareholder of the companies that own Qd Resources and Qd Metals. The administrator has highlighted nearly $190 million in forgiven loans dating back 4 years. There are also more than $220 million in related party loans from Queensland Nickel to companies or interests owned or controlled by Mr Palmer, which raise the most serious questions. The administrator's not suggesting Clive Palmer was asleep at the wheel. On the contrary, he's suggesting Mr Palmer acted against the interests of Queensland Nickel.
That is suggesting conduct that goes to the propriety of your actions as a director and for bad faith, basically.
Regardless of the company's structure, the administrator is holding Clive Palmer liable for his actions. He could be hauled before the courts if Queensland Nickel goes into liquidation, and ASIC is likely to look at launching criminal proceedings carrying a maximum 5-year jail term.
The old adage, you can run but you can't hide, is probably true of Mr Palmer as much as anybody else.
That's something sacked workers in Townsville will be hoping for. Philip Lasker, ABC News.